Welcome to our Edge Highlighting Basics video, which is a follow-up to our PDF. In this I'm going to talk a little bit about what I talked about in the PDF, but I'm also going to explore some more possibilities of what you can do for edge highlighting, so tips and tricks, and what to consider when you're painting your miniature. I have in front of me 3 different stages of painted miniature. I've got one which I've just got my red on, perfect, ready for highlighting. I've got the miniature that I used for the PDF, so we've got our highlighting already in place on top, and I've got a fully painted Terminator that I've done in exactly the same style as the other 2. This is a good example of what I'm going to talk about to start with, which is the heavy metal style of edge highlighting miniatures. So the heavy metal or Games Workshop standard style is to highlight every piece of detail on your miniature, no matter where it is or whether it arguably makes sense in the real world. So for example, we've got these arms would cast shadow on the rest of the miniature underneath, and that would mean that in the real world they wouldn't necessarily have an edge highlight. However, I have obviously painted one on following that style, and it's because it looks really good when it's photographed or videoed, or when you pick up that model and just have a look at it. It looks really good to have all the detail really easily visible, particularly for Games Workshop, when they're trying to sell the product, when it's on their website or on a box or in a book. If you can look at it and see every piece of detail, the consumer, which is us, know exactly what's on the model and what to expect from it. Now obviously that's not hugely realistic, so for example if I take my trusty homemade wet palette here, you can see that the entire thing isn't rimmed by these massive highlights that I've put all over the model. We don't have this black bolt gun with a huge black and grey and white lines down the side. We do however have some forms of edge highlighting though. You can look at the edge of this clip and you can see that it is brighter than the rest of it, but that bright line is minuscule. And the reality is to do with scale. Now obviously this lid is much bigger than our miniatures. So what we're trying to do is represent on these models what we're seeing on our real life everyday objects, but in a way that our eyes can then translate it. So obviously if we put no highlights on, that plastic would arguably get that same level of edge highlighting as this lid does. It would just be naturally lit by the light. Unfortunately, because we're trying to trick our mind into seeing this 28mm figure into being a multiple 10 or 11 foot tall Terminator, we're going to need to paint that on ourselves. And that means we are going to paint on thicker highlights that we don't actually see in real life, but it is trying to replicate that. Finding a happy medium between how many highlights you want versus highlighting everything is a skill in itself. Do you want to go for that heavy metal style of rimming literally every single surface with a highlight, or do you want to go for a more realistic approach of I'll just go for the top areas that are catching the light and leave the rest unhighlighted? It's entirely up to you, particularly as painting miniatures is an art form, so it's up to you as to how you want to represent your art. For myself, I am following that heavy metal approach of painting everything. We saw that to start with in this miniature that I did for the Basics Highlighting PDF, where I've highlighted the upper back of the model on top here. If I can get the camera to focus, that's always a trick in itself. And I painted the rim of the head guard, and I also painted the edges of the sensor, purely as a form of demonstration. I'm going to replicate that now on our next miniature and show you how I do that, in addition to moving my brush, what angles I'm going to use, and some things to consider while doing that. I move those 2 out of the way so I don't accidentally get extra paint on them. I have got my wet palette ready, and I'm using a wet palette, again just to keep the paint fresh while I'm using it, but you do want to consider not making your paint too thin. So I've got some water on my brush. I'm going to get some of my Evil Sun Scarlet as my highlight colour. So my base colour is Mephiston, and I've got some on my wet palette. I don't want to thin this too much. If your paint gets really thin and watery, it's going to be harder, I'll just do as an example, it's going to be harder for your edge highlights to stick. And that's because the lack of paint content in them can mean that they're so watery that the paint doesn't really go on very well. So you do want to make sure that you get a slightly thicker piece. You want to water it down a little bit. You want a slightly thicker bit of paint on your brush. And the first step when edge highlighting is to consider how you're going to transition from your mid-tone, so what your majority armor colour is, to your brightest colour. So my brightest colour is Fire Dragon Bright. I'm going through Evil Sun Scarlet, into Wild Rider Red, and then up to Fire Dragon Bright in the Games Workshop colours range. Now obviously Fire Dragon Bright is much brighter than the red, so I'm going to want that to be an incredibly thin line. And to sell that transition between the Mephiston red base coat that's over everything and this Fire Dragon Bright, I'm going to want to do successively thinner lines. What that means is I'm going to start out with what's considered a chunky highlight or a thick highlight or a starting highlight, and it is going to be much thicker than the rest. And it will be visible beneath the other highlights, but it will help sell that transition from the darker to the lighter. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to run my brush along the edge of the model. Now you notice I'm holding my paintbrush at an angle to the edge of the model, and what that lets me do is almost just drag the edge along, the tip of the brush along the edge of the model, and it gets that thick line in there. Now the more you increase the angle of your brush, so if I'm painting almost flat here, the thicker your line will be, versus if I'm at 45 degrees, you'll have your thinnest line possible. Now for a chunky highlight though, I do want to replicate that on both the top panel and the bottom panel so that we have that extra thickness of paint to help sell that transition. So now that I've done that super low line along the back, I'm going to do the same thing on top and get my brush along and just drag the paint into place. You're really just touching the tip of your brush to the plastic here, and this is why it's great to practice on Terminators, because they have these really nice sharp angles that let you really practice getting your brush in somewhere. And I'm doing nothing more than moving my brush angle along the edge. Obviously that's a really simple one. I can hold the model upright and I can drag my brush along there. What happens if we're doing a more complicated area? Let's say we're doing the arms in here. I don't want to move my brush more than I need to, because this is the comfortable angle that I'm used to painting at. I have the best muscle control here. So move the miniature. Consider how you can reposition the miniature in a good sort of comfortable place where your hands are still touching, so you're still bracing, you've still got the best control, you're going to have the least shake. So I consider that I'll go here, and then again, using the tip of the brush to run along the edge of a model, or the edge of a surface, I'm just going to stroke my brush in there and catch the edge of that elbow pad. My paint's actually dried a little bit on my brush, so I'm going to get a little bit more and just do that again, just to really seal in or sell that highlight. So there we go. You can see that has let me get a nice highlight in there. And again, different angles require the miniature to be in a different place all the time. It's something you just have to get used to. But once you get used to being comfortable moving the miniature and keeping your brush in a fairly similar position, you'll very quickly be able to paint highlights in places you'd originally considered quite hard. Now you'll notice that in this area I can't do my edge of the brush stroking along the edge of something like that. I'm having to reposition, and I am actually having to pull the brush along the edge. Now this is a harder form of edge highlighting, but is required in some places that are hard to reach. The way I'm doing this is touching the tip to the surface. I'll show on my hand here, and I'm just pulling the brush down. Because I'm pulling the brush towards me, it's naturally keeping just the tip on. If I was pushing, you'll see my brush goes in and the bristles start to splay, which will obviously, it will damage your brush, it will start to bend the tip of your brush, and also if you push in and your bristles splay out, that thickens how much paint is going on the model. Whereas when you pull it towards you, if we show you on the hand here, if you pull that brush towards you, the bristles stay the same thickness, so you get a nice smooth straight thick line. I'm using quite an old brush here, so it doesn't have a particularly fine point to it, which is perfect for what I want for my first chunky highlight. So this is a size 1 Artis Opus brush that I've been using for quite some time. So the tip has started to go now. It's using it for a couple of months, and that means I save this kind of brush for doing my first stage of thicker highlights where I do want that thicker paint, and then I'll use a fresh new brush when I want to do my next stage of highlights. But to quickly catch up so that our model is the same as our first one, I'm going to come in and highlight just the top of this Terminator for now for this video. We notice that again, I'm just doing the same things I was talking about. I'm just stroking the edge of the brush over, keeping it at that angle that lets me have the best control of just a back and forth motion. So that I'm not going up or down with my brush, I'm not doing anything really, it's literally just a back and forth controlled by my thumb and first 2 fingers. And it's all about, take that bit of extra time to look at, well, how can I hold my miniature in that next position to get that next angle I need, it may take a bit longer to think about, but it will take you less time and less hassle to do the edge highlighting on it. So I'm looking at this top square now thinking, well, how am I going to get my brush in there for the best result? We've got a nice sharp edge for some of this, and for those I can again just do my run the tip of the brush along the edge of the model, 45 degrees or so, and get a nice smooth highlight on those areas. On this end here, it's actually it's not as sharp an edge. You know, we've got almost the plastic curving in rather than being a straight edge. And for that, I have ended up with a thicker line, which you can see. Now, if you do end up with different thickness of chunky lines, you can always go back in with your base coat, so for me, my Mephiston red, and just cut back in. You know, you can paint almost a straight line along the edge of the first line. It will blend into your base coat, it will cover mistakes, and it will just neaten up that line. I'll show that up here. So if I deliberately go really thick on that there, so when that dries, you'll see that, you know, there's not really any edge highlighting there. I've almost painted the entire top surface. If I get myself some Mephiston red and then cut back into that top surface, it'll help redefine where that edge highlight is, and it'll help you tidy up any mistakes you might make. I get the camera to focus on it there for you. So you can see that, you know, it's no edge highlight. Get that Mephiston red in there, and just paint, you know, I've just painted a straight line up the middle of the top of this pad, and it'll help create that area of separation. And that's how I would cover up mistakes as well that I've made in highlighting. You know, if I'm going along a nice edge and I've only got water on now and my brush slips, you can see where this water is. That could have been paint if I'd had paint on my brush. If I get my base colour, my mid-tone that I've painted the whole mini with, you can just go back in and you can just re-tidy up where you might have made mistakes with that colour and very quickly correct any errors. It's also great for practicing your different types of highlighting, because if you're painting yourself a thin line between two areas, you're going to need to almost like practice that pulling the brush towards you technique for getting straight, smooth lines. So it's almost practicing edge highlighting itself if you're going back and correcting other areas you've made mistakes. I will quickly finish off top of this model though, so we can move on to the next colour. And again, I'm just thinking, well, what's the easiest way to do this? We'll get my brush at this angle, holding the model in this position. I've got another line there. Just go along the top, on the edge, and along the top here. And the final bit, edge highlighting this upper panel and the top of the head here. I'm not going to worry about the top of this sensor today though, as we did see that in the PDF. So that is just the top of this miniature, literally only the centre highlighted, and you can already see that it stands out from how it was before. It's not as bright as our next sets of highlights, but if you're painting, let's say you're wanting to go for a more realistic approach where the underside of your model, which is really dark, isn't going to be lit as much, you can stop there. You know, if I'm going in underneath and I'm painting the bottoms of these elbow pads, I maybe don't want it as brightly highlighted as the rest of the model. So that can be a good stopping place for me, because we've got some level of highlight. It's showing that there are clear edges there, but it's not going to be brightly lit and orangey as the top of the model. So it's worth considering, you know, how far do you want to take your highlights, even if you are highlighting everything versus not highlighting everything. Just consider, like, you know, what sort of steps do you want to do over the entire area. It's okay to not highlight everything, and it's okay to not take your brightest highlights over every part of the model. Now, as I said though, this is an older brush, and I'm going to move on to finer highlights, so I am actually going to switch from this size 1 to a brand new size 1 Artis Opus brush, which has a nice crisp point to it. And that point is obviously going to be the difference night and day of that other brush for getting a nice super smooth line. As I mentioned earlier, I'm switching up to Wild Rider Red, which is brighter, it's more orangey than Evil Sun's, and it'll start to look like a really nice edge highlight. Now, if you're wanting to spend more and more time on your model, maybe you're wanting to start painting showcase models for display or for competitions, you can obviously do mixes to transition between these two and just build up more and more and more highlights. Essentially, it's up to you as to how strong you want your transitions to be. For gaming pieces, you know, I'd do a nice chunky highlight, I would do a nice regular highlight, and then I'd probably do my next brightest highlight and stop there. For display pieces, I would put more effort into transitioning between all of the different colours and working from there. You might have noticed as well, I'm doing what I do every time I use a wet palette, and I mention in all my videos. I start darker and I start to move lighter as I move up the palette, and I have my thickest colour at the top, and if I'm going to create glazes or thin my paint down, I move down the palette towards me, and that means I know that my darkest, thickest colour is always top left going to brightest. And it just helps with planning out how you're going to use a wet palette and keeping all your paints in order, so you're not like mixing paints accidentally or pushing some into each other, or going sort of like, you know, naturally moving around the palette and making mistakes. I have been in painting sessions before when I had a much messier palette where I'd go down and get a paint to my brush and go, nah, that's the wrong one. Back to edge highlighting though. So you can see that that chunky highlight has come through on the top of this Space Marine. So what I'm going to want to do now is a much thinner highlight along the rest of those surfaces. So again, I've got a bit of paint on my brush. It's really not much. You can see that it's just the tip. And again, I'm going to go in and stroke the tip of the brush along, but I'm barely applying pressure. Because I'm applying less pressure, the line is thinner, and because I'm at 45 degrees, it's touching less of the plastic. You know, so I was talking earlier about if your brush is nearly flat to the model, it will catch more of the plastic. If you increase that angle to 45 degrees, you'll barely be touching the plastic and you'll get the perfect amount of paint on. So that's what I've done here. So if I show you again from this angle, if I'm going to edge highlight the side here, I'll be stroking the edge of the brush along at 45 degrees. And it's just catching the barest minimum amount of paint required on the edge. Don't worry about overburdening your brush. If you overpaint your edge highlights, it's harder to recover. If you don't have enough paint on, you can always add more. So I'd always go under rather than over in terms of loading your brush with paint. So you can see I've done two edges right now, the front one and the side one, and they already look so much brighter than these other two remaining sides. So if I go in my 45 degrees, going from below, alternatively I could obviously have rotated them on and gone in from above, but generally I'm controlling my angle by moving the miniature and then just stroking my fingers back and forth to get my highlight. There's also nothing wrong with only highlighting part of your miniature if you want to take a break and come back to another part later. You know, you can work in any section you want. It's going to be easy enough for me to come back and reapply my colours all over. It will be quicker if you work over the entire model and do your base colour over the entire thing. As your first chunky highlight over the entire thing, then your next steps of highlights, because it means you're not going to keep switching between colours as much as I would do if I did a bit, then stop, and then a bit, then stop, and so on. How do you then do a thin edge that you can't drag the side of your brush along? This does take more practice, but it's what I was talking about earlier of getting just a bit of paint on the tip of your brush and dragging that brush down. What that does is brings your brush almost permanently to a point. I've got so little paint on the end, and it's a thinner tip than my previous brush because this one is newer. And it does take practice and control, and I'm just going to drag the tip down along the edge of the model, being careful to almost be not touching the plastic. And what that lets us do is get an edge highlight on there, like that. And again, I'm going to do the same here so that you can see it. You can see I've got quite a chunky red line down the edge of this panel. Just going to stroke the tip of the brush carefully down the edge there. You notice I'm actually using a very similar motion. So when I'm edge highlighting from side to side with my fingers, I'm doing that, as I said, using my thumb and 2 forefingers to dictate it. When I'm stroking down, I'm doing the same thing. Thumb and 2 forefingers dictating how much my brush moves and in careful, controlled motions. Again, it does take practice and time to get used to what you want to do. So you won't necessarily see the best results straight away, but as soon as your hand starts to get trained to do that, I can guarantee you if you went out and bought a single box of 10 Space Marines, any kind, Firstborn or Primaris, and just practiced edge highlighting on those 10 in this way, you will go from potentially getting paint splodges everywhere and maybe a few mistakes or slippages to having crisp looking highlights by the end of that box. Just practice on every surface you can get your hands on. If you don't want to use Space Marines, try a sprue. I've got a skull sprue on my desk, but if we look at it, I've got curved surfaces here. I've got circles where I could practice going around an edge. I've got bits of sprue or gates that I can then go, well, there's an edge there, let's try edge highlighting that. Just spray it with a base coat so that you have something to build on, just if it's Chaos Black or whatever. Take any colour paint. You don't need to practice your edge highlighting with sequential colours. If you really want to practice on a model you're not going to use, think about using drastically different colours to see how that transition changes. Now obviously we're going for a complementary transition up through our reds, but you could go spray your model white, then edge highlight black, and then edge highlight red, and then edge highlight blue, all over that same thing as you build up the different thickness of layers, so that you can see the different colours underneath and see how thick or thin your various lines are. And practicing in that way will help you practice or see where you might be making mistakes, or if there are any areas that could do with improvement. So I've just got the last two sides to do to this. Notice that I am going slowly, I'm not rushing. Because if you rush and have to make a mistake, it will take you longer to correct it than if you just take your time in the first place. A lot of the time as well, 2 edge highlights are more than enough to then just call that miniature done. That is a good looking soldier. If I turned up with my Space Marines all fully highlighted with those 2 highlights, they'll look smashing on a table. I'm using my Blood Angels for a kill team, so I want to put a little bit more effort in because there's only going to be, 3 models on the table. So there is that incentive to do a bit more work. But this model, for example, only has two main highlights and then a fine edge highlight to try and show off some of the detail. And the fine edge highlight is what I call that final brightest colour. Maybe doesn't go over the entire thing, and this is where I do really start to think about my light sources. I don't want this orange over literally everything. So on this finished miniature, because I've got my light source coming from above, my bright oranges are isolated to sort of like, the tips of these edges where it's most likely going to catch it. Again, on the model that we have for the PDF guide, it's a similar thing. I don't want my orange to be everywhere. I want it to mimic where my light source is coming from, so you'll see it's on the tips here. It's just right on the edge. And on the back panel where the lights come in and caught this edge of the panel, this corner here. It's all about thinking where your light sources are going to come from, even if you are doing the highlight everything heavy metal approach, which is, I feel, is a bit untrue. They don't highlight everything. They do think about light sources. They do think about, what corners are going to catch light, what materials are going to be more reflective. Just in terms of simply explaining it, that is the easiest way of going about it. So I've got my Fire Dragon Bright on my wet palette. I've thinned it with water as I was putting it on the palette, and you can see it's nice and thin there. And thinking about my light sources, I'm going to go, okay, well, I want that's going to catch the most light. This top edge of this curve is going to catch the most light. This edge or this corner is going to catch some light, and then my secondary light source is coming from behind. So again, we're going to catch this corner of a panel. Just very carefully paint the edge, and you can see already that those corners are slightly brighter without being distinctively orange. It has the hint of orange to them, enough to help it stand out, but without it being overbearing. So I hope you find that useful. And if you do have any questions or comments, or you want some clarification on anything I've been talking about, do leave your comments on our Patreon and we will answer them as soon as we can. Thank you very much.